today we have Terry Feix joining us, and I am fortunate to get to learn from him regularly as he serves as the executive pastor at my home church, Crossings Community Church in Oklahoma City. And those who know him know that he loves the Lord. He's a map aficionado, and he's also a really big fan of his new grandchildren. And so, Terry, we are just so glad that you're here. And why don't you just tell us a little bit about yourself, where you're from, what you like to do, what you've been thinking about, just so everyone can get to know you.
Absolutely. Thank you, Candace. It's a pleasure to join you here with all your listeners. And I'm really a fan of the ministry work, by the way, that you do at Crossings. I don't know if everyone realizes how much you are involved with young adults, but also with our youth. So thank you very much. You're really pouring into the youth of this congregation. Well, maybe the shortest way to talk about myself is, for those who don't know much about me, is, let's see, professionally. So my degrees are in mathematics and biblical languages. So I have a master's in mathematics, and then I studied Greek and Hebrew and Latin in college. And when I came out of college, I worked in IT. So the first half of my business career was in information technology, various things, a lot of coding, networks, etc. About halfway through my business career, made a move, which is an interesting God story, but made a move. And you have to remember, at this point, I've got a pocket pen protector. I've got white socks. I'm just a total computer nerd. I am an introvert by nature. I hated large groups of people, and I love my computers. And so that guy got transformed because I moved to the sales organization, a large company, what's now AT&T, but at that time was SBC Communications. And I began to learn the skill of selling, became successful at that, and spent most of the second half of my career as a sales vice president over national accounts, various areas, ran very large organizations, and had big financial commitments to the corporation. So I was very fortunate to learn how to work at an executive level. So that was the second half of my career. Then third career was 16 years ago. I was not unhappy where I was, but Marty Grubbs at Crossings had approached me several times about potentially coming to Crossings, and made the mistake of saying that I would pray about that. And so, of course, I had to, and I did. And a short version of the story is that God really opened a lot of doors, which would have taken God to do, because we had just bought AT&T. And so my organization was expanding, and I was able to wrangle an early out, but largely because my boss realized this is what I felt like God wanted me to do. It had never been my desire to work at a church. I was going to continue my business career and at some point do a teaching ministry, because by that time I had gone away from my introvert ways and I started teaching a little bit. And so I decided that's what I would do, but God had other ideas. And so what Crossings needed at the time, and Marty Grubbs, very visionary guy, I had a lot of business background. So we needed management and we needed teaching, and God seems to have prepared me for that, which I know that's not the subject of this podcast, but I will plug this and say, if you're wanting to know what your destiny is, a lot of times what God's plan for you is and can be seen based on what he has prepared you to do. So I didn't have any great desire to work at a church. I mean, I wasn't against it. This is a great church, just wasn't what I wanted to do. But as my wife and I prayed about it, I realized, well, actually, I've been prepared to do the very things that they need. So sometimes calling is nothing more, in my view, than God's preparation meeting a need. Mm-hmm. And so that's the way it was for me. So I felt like, well, he's prepared me. Here's a need. And so I made that move. So my third career has been that of a pastor, and I've had to learn that skill as well. Yeah. Spiritually, I didn't become a Christian till late teens, and I had already explored pretty much everything except Christianity by that time. So I'm a latecomer to the faith, but was very fortunate that God was gracious and kind of kept after me when I was chasing other things. So I'll stop there, but that's kind of my business background and a little bit of my faith story.
Yeah, no, it's so interesting. I laugh because when you say IT, that's where I am now. I work for a software company, and I actually work in IT as a project manager, but it cracks me up to say IT to people because I am not like your IT girl at all. Like I used to teach kindergarten, so I love to teach, so I'm with you on that. And then like when something's wrong, like I'm usually the one that's calling for help, support on the desktop, and it's like, have you turned it on? Have you turned it off? Try it again. Like very basic things. So it's I always have to like let people know I'm not really IT.
Right.
Different, but yes, but I love.
Well, what you do is important because generally the techies, the coders, et cetera, really need an interpreter with the outside world. And so you need someone that's bilingual like you.
Yes, you have to very much communication based in what I do.
Exactly.
Yeah, no, that's really fun. Well, I do have to ask because I know that you love maps. Is that knowing like your background in the math and IT and all of that and the biblical language, that's fascinating. So when did you really start to love maps? Is that something that you've always, like even as a kid, were you intrigued with maps, or, when did that kind of start or develop for you?
That's a good question, because at Crossings, I can no longer teach without a map. And I created that myself. But my interests back through my business years was I read widely, and I just have a lot of interests. And so I'm very interested in politics, biography, history, archaeology, anything technical, whether it's mathematics or it's genetics or whatever. I just have a wide ranging interest. So I read a lot. But when you read a lot of history, you realize that having a visual perspective, maps of, the ancient world or maps of the 18th century France, whatever it is you're reading about at that time, are very helpful. So at some point in my teaching career, I just took that, because my goal is, if you want to understand my ministry, it's really very simple. I want to make the Bible come alive for people so they can see the vitality that is there. It's not in me, it's in the Word. I just want them to see the vitality of the Word. And so I'm big on context. And so I weave a lot of archaeology and history and politics and economics into the biblical story so that it comes alive. And maps are one way to do that. But I may have created a monster with the map.
No, it's great because it brings so much context, and it's cool to even say what you were speaking of before, just how God prepares you for the calling He has, and now you get to serve, even host a podcast with your son, So We Speak. So you want to talk a little bit about that too?
Yeah, it's interesting. That's really Cole's project to start a media company for a very specific purpose. The idea is to help people think Christianly and to be informed on what's going on in the world without being conformed to the world. So thinking Christianly. And of course, the phrase "so we speak" appears twice in the New Testament. But in 1 Thessalonians, Paul says basically, we've been entrusted with the gospel, so we speak. Not to please men, but to please God. And so it was a great idea of his, and got a lot of writers in the blog. He has, we've had a lot of donors supported. It's completely donor supported. We don't have to charge for anything. We don't have to have a paywall. And the podcast is one of those things. So thanks for highlighting that. It's just a way to try to help people interact with current events and ideas in a Christian way. How do we think about those things? So a lot of kind of what you're doing in the sense that, and we need more of this, and that is, how do I translate what I believe into the particular circumstances of my life?
Well, and that's really what I want to talk today more about too, because not that long ago you were speaking to the Sunday school class about contentment, and you really came from it from the angle of like how important what we think is for our emotions and leading our emotions in that. And so it is funny though, like after you shared that, the days that followed, I had opportunities to get to practice this. And before, I would never really characterize myself as an anxious person. I think now thinking about it, it's like anxious sounds like a big word for like big problems. And just little things, just very small, like pinpricks, just started kind of getting under my skin a little bit, and even like keeping me up at night. And that's true that it was. I was anxious, and so being able to label it, but then the words that God gave you really helped me experience some personal breakthrough that night and even the days that followed, and just learning to lead my emotions with my thoughts. And so I wanted to talk about that more today, just because I know many are listening and they have a lot on their minds. They
Right.
have been up at night, or they can't even focus at work, or even having like the stomach issues that come with all the anxious energy. And so really wanted to help bring them to some breakthrough too. And so wanted to hear just a little bit more about your story. And you said, kind of going back just a little bit, you said in those early years you were researching a lot about the other religions before you really came to Christ and followed him. And so was it more the logical side that asking more questions at the beginning of your faith versus that camp high emotional side? And like, when did you see like the head and the heart really start to connect in your faith?
Yeah, that's a great question. I tend to, people are oriented differently. I don't mean that in a deterministic sense, in that personality profiling, whatever it may be, whether it's the Big Five personality profile or it's the Enneagram, are basically at their best trying to describe tendencies in one's personality. But my tendency is to approach things from a thoughtful way. It's just the way I'm wired. Other people tend to lead with their emotions, and there are pros and cons to each. But for me, I was looking in my late teens for a way to make sense of life. I thought, if I'm about to start this life, I really don't want to get to the end and go, well, that was a waste of time. And, I wish I'd figured out what the whole point of this thing was before I got started. I thought, well, before I get started, I'll figure out the point of this. So I read and explored virtually all of Western philosophy. Seriously. I mean, I just really looked at a lot of different philosophies of life, and they do a really good job of trying to solve some essential problems in life: problem of suffering, problem of anxiety, problems around the circumstances of life. But I didn't find any of them compelling, in that they were at least consistent, but their presuppositions weren't necessarily true. So I went to Eastern religions, became a practicing Buddhist for a couple of years, and studied a lot of Eastern religion, which approaches it very differently. And it's not so much cognitive, so maybe a little more holistic approach. Nevertheless, at the end of that road, I realized while that was comforting, it was not true. And I wanted more than a happy pill, if you will. I wanted something more than just, I'll believe in the fairy godmother because she makes me feel better. I know she's not real, but it makes me feel better. Right. And I really wasn't content with that. I don't think most people are. They want to know that what they believe actually corresponds to reality. Mm-hmm. So in the end, I became convinced in my mind, which was going to have to happen for me because of the way I was wired. It had to start there, that Christianity was true. Christianity had evidentiary backing. It couldn't prove that God existed, but it made the most sense. And that as a mathematician, I understand there are many things you can't prove. We all believe in things. We all have faith in things that we cannot prove. No matter what someone tells you, however, quote, scientific they may be, we all believe in things that we cannot prove. And I didn't have a heartburn with that. I just wanted to know what's the best evidence. And once I reached that point, then my heart opened up. And so I don't believe you can be a Christian merely because you feel close to God, nor can you be a Christian merely because you know all the right doctrines. And so at that part, once that was satisfied, the Holy Spirit kind of opened my heart, and I had not only an intellectual response to God, but also an emotional response. And I think both are necessary. I just think sometimes it comes in a different order from us, for different people.
Yeah. Now, I do see, even with my middle school girls, that there are those that lead with their head, and when they ask it, they got sidetracked. But those girls that lead with maybe they went to private school, they have a lot of head knowledge, and
right.
So, there's excitement building in them, and their faith is coming more alive. And so, even for me, I've noticed that it's not, this head and the heart is not like an intersection in our faith. It's not a one-time event. We're
right.
continually growing more in that. And the spiritual disciplines like prayer and worship and studying scripture, it's where I'm learning more about God, but I'm also feeling more too. And the more that I learn and the more I feel, the more I learn about the character of God, the more tangible it is for me. And I experience him more intimately and I feel him more. And that's where, like you said, like your faith becomes